Bismillah. Before we actually answer those questions, I think it's really important to deconstruct the terms first, because without deconstructing the terms, then we're going to go in a ball where you want to keep in mind the one that lays out the term is eventually going to be the one that's defining the term. And it's really dangerous to use, for example, terms of feminism, gender, patriarchy, etc., because the ones that laid out the term are going to be the ones to define the term. And they'll have the right to not only define, but also choose who to let in or out of that term. And therefore, without the Muslim community really realizing that they are going to be stereotyped again with a certain image. Now, when we look at ethics, the philosophy of ethics in the West, there's so many different roads to it, but the different theories in the West is that, is it necessarily based on the act itself being right, or is it based on what it leads to, or is it based on the basis and the moral agent and how we actually look at that? Now, when we look at so many different laws out there, not everything is necessarily based on what they would think is right or wrong, and that let's make some democratic vote or elections, or let's see if this gets an acceptance and how many people accept it or not. But that's why there are certain things, which is exactly like what John Locke was considering, that there are certain things that we see in nature, if you go against it, that was going to lead to chaos. Now, having that being said, that there are certain things in nature that we could see that are different, that if you go against it, that's going to lead in chaos, whether you like it or you don't. You may not like it that stealing and going against somebody's property or somebody's consent or somebody's liberty is it may not feel comfortable for you all the time for me to tell you, no, you can't take that. But the reality is, on a legal or on a universal maxim, there are certain things that we could see that must be applied in order to bring about stability. I'm not here saying this is how Islam considers as ethical or not ethical, but when it comes to justice, this is something that even the philosophers of ethics will have noticed, that you have to have certain things. It isn't until when it came to postmodernism that deconstructing the philosophy of ethics and regarding that it's all about individualism, and that there is no objective or subjective morality. There's no subjective morality to turn to. Now, looking at that, in Islam, the system is totally different, in where, like I said, we first have to question the philosophy of justice and the philosophy of ethics in the West before we take a term that the feminists are proposing or different groups are proposing and apply it on a Muslim world or on a Muslim system without us realizing how and where the idea comes from. The philosophy that the term is coming from is actually from the philosophy of individualism, in where it regards that all individuals are supposed to be equal, and that from that basis, that there's no male or female difference, and the differences are only set by the society. If we are to assume that there are no differences, not between the male and between the female, not physically, not socially, and not any differences on the finances, well, what that led to is that led to when speaking of theory, not only is it on theory, but the implication actually had different grounds as well, in where feminism saw that because women were not getting into the same level, not into the same work, not into the same successes as to what The neo-Marxist view of success was more about employment and more about making money. So therefore, they considered that men are going to be, or were the reason why women were not getting into the same level of, again, the successes that they considered successes. And here you don't see me quoting and, quote unquote, what they considered as successes. So when we look at the terms, it's really important to deconstruct where it's coming from. And that is why, because feminism saw in men, and of course somebody's going to say, well, there are different schools of feminism. There's the first wave, second wave, third wave, and right now fourth wave, and each one has a different thing. You see, when you want to look at the theory of it, it's really important to see how far can that theory go in terms of application. So that is why when you look at the feminist theory brought on ground pro-abortion, brought on ground in where the LGBT and the different things that related to that. Now, looking at the different ways, it is considered as that idea, considered that women are equal, and therefore the application is supposed to be 100% equal. But the question is that necessarily what we find in nature? Meaning what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created in the world around us. Do we necessarily find that men and women are equal physically? Are they equal? Are they equal in the things that they actually do? Is their biological creation necessarily the same in everything? Now, therefore, on ground, in family, in making things in life, is it necessarily supposed to be the same, and therefore it has to be equal in every single way? That's not the case in Islam. In Islam, it regarded that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the system with the system around us based on the number of different things in order to bring about stability, not equality, but stability. And this stability is in order to create a stable family system, a stable society, and of course, generally in where it's keeping the health and preserving the health for every single individual and also the community. Now, when we look at to answer the question, in order to answer the question, there are a number of things to look at. Number one, which is the center? Where does that idea come from? What is the idea? What is the center of Islamic legislature? So just like Sister Zainab was saying, that we first have to look at, number one, the musharra, which is basically the system. Is it coming from the man? And if we want to prove that it's coming from the man, it is only benefiting the man. So we need to look at the center, and then need to look at the discourse. Is it only to benefit man, and is it only to bring about the things that relate to man, or is it otherwise? So we need to deconstruct the different ideas and need to deconstruct the different implications in a woman's life and also in a man's life to see if it really is centered or coming from a male perspective in a male center, or is it coming from a different center? So how do we always know that? Well, we don't always know that unless we also see the khitab, unless we see the implication on ground, the implication of theory, and then we're able to see, is it necessarily male-centered or not? So we need to see the application. Well, let's look at the center. The center that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا وَالَّذِي أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْكَ. In the center of it is that there are three different epistemological resources. Number one is that there's a dhann, which is speculation. Two, there's the lobbying, there's the hawa, there's the person's inclinations, and finally there's al-wahi, according to Surah Al-Najm, that epistemologically speaking goes to three. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شَرَعَ لَكُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا وَصَّى بِهِ نُوحًا, that the deen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had legislated is basically what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent on to Prophet Nuh and to the rest of the Anbiya. At the same time, the ayah also laid out, or other ayat laid out, that فَمَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ رَبِّهِ فَلْيَعْمَلْ عَمَلًا صَالِحًا وَلَا يُشْرِكْ بِعِبَادَةِ رَبِّهِ أَحَدًا, laid out that people in front of this law, that من كان يرجو لقاء ربه, that whoever wants to meet their Lord Almighty in the Akhirah, then let them do what is righteous and not associate any partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another ayah, in al-hukmu illa lillah, clearly and literally said that the ruling and the center for legislature is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّهُ, that no one would worship but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to worship, it is a lot more comprehensive than to mean a ritual, but it also means actions and how we define right and wrong and how we live our life based on. In another ayah, أَمْ لَهُمْ شُرَكَاءَ شَرَعُوا لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ مَا لَمْ يَأْذَنْ بِهِ اللَّهُ. Do they have any other partners that defined, that is شَرَعَ لَهُم مِّنَ الدِّينِ, that defined legislature for them what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not permit? So you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the ayat is clearly saying that legislature goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In another ayah, clearly said that مَن يَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا مِّن ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنثَىٰ فَلَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. Whoever does good from male or female, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to resurrect them in a good life in the hereafter. Now, when we look at the different wordings, now we're going back to the center. When we're looking at the different wordings, you could see when it comes to men that there is, remember, we're using the same kind of the same route, where we're talking about the center, then we're going to talk about the discourse, then we're going to talk about the application here. So when we're looking at the discourse itself, you could see, for example, that that in some ayat it actually held men accountable. Let's see the first ayat. فأكلا منها فبدت لهما سوآتهما وطفقا يخصفان عليهما من ورق الجنة وعصى آدم ربه فغوى. That Adam had committed the sin. Adam committed the sin, ate from the tree. Although we know that it wasn't just Adam that ate from the tree, but it was also Hawa that also ate from the tree. But the ayah emphasized that it was Adam that ate from the tree and committed the sin, although Eve or Hawa was also included. At the same time, so here emphasized Adam committing the sin and not Hawa. Now let's look at, for example, the ayah, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, and deal with them, on good terms and good terms. فَإِنْ كَرِهْتُمُوهُنَّ, if you hated them, فَعَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَيَجْعَلَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا. You may hate something and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may make and bring something good within it. Now, if we could look at these two and scrutinize these two different ayat, we could see that here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala held Adam accountable and emphasized that he had committed the sin, although Eve was there and also committed the sin, but she was not even mentioned, or at least in that ayah. وَعَشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying and asking men directly that they should deal with women, or deal with women on good terms. And even if they hate something, maybe something that they did not like, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them that you may like other things. Now, this responsibility, is it a matter of taklif or tashrif? Is this responsibility a matter of or is this position of being responsible, of being the head, is it necessarily responsibility or honor? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in numerous ayat, we could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is holding the men accountable, in where the discourse or the words that are used are actually straightforward speaking to the men, saying, أَنْكِحُوا الْأَيَامَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّالِحِينَ, telling the men, get the women that are not married, find them good spouses, etc. وَإِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاء, this is directly speaking to the men. If you divorce women, then such and such, فَلَا تَعْضُلُوهُنَّ, don't prevent them from going back to their husbands. This is holding them responsible. This is holding them in a position of responsibility and not honor necessarily. In the other ayah, الرِّجَالُ قَوَّمُونَ عَلَى النِّسَاء, but then although it said قَوَّمُون, meaning responsible, meaning having the authority, but it also clarified بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. It is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given certain qualities for men and certain qualities for women. So meaning that one is to complete one another, as the ayah actually clarified that المؤمنون والمؤمنات بعضهم أولياء بعض, that they are, the word is awliya. When we talk about the word awliya, الولاية or al-walaya, to be more accurate, al-walaya is a place of authority, is a place of decision making, is a place of taking a certain role of making decisions and deciding different things for within that community. When you look at the ayah, awliya ba'd, that the believing men and the believing women, they're awliya ba'd, meaning that they too can hold those positions. But in order to continue, when we're talking about الرجال قوامون على النساء, this is to base it on the base of al-haq, on the base that they are all servants to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But فضل الله بعضهم على بعض, that some of that men might have qualities that women don't have. But at the end, in order to ensure that men do not abuse their position and take it as if it was a place of honor, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, فَلَا تَبْغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ سَبِيلًا. Don't take advantage of the women, because in the other hadith that the Prophet ﷺ actually says that women are awanun indakum. Awan means that they are like hostages in your own homes. So the Prophet ﷺ said that awan فَإِنَّهُنَّ awanun indakum, that they are like hostages in your homes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clarified, فَلَا تَبْغُوا عَلَيْهِنَّ سَبِيلًا. Don't take advantage of their weaknesses or their physical weaknesses, or at least their obedience to you. Why? Because inna Allah كان عليا كبيرا, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is most high and of course most almighty. Why? Because he is almighty. In other words, he will retaliate for them, even if you may have thought that you can abuse your positions and think of it as an honorable position where you could actually abuse that woman. Now, the other part when we're talking about general Sharia maxims, the general Sharia maxims that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out is, number one, acknowledge the differences, the physical differences, psychological differences, social differences based on the different capacities that they might have, which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, looking at that ayah, says, بِمَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ, that the men may have certain qualities and women may have certain qualities. At the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. That even when it comes to responsibility, it is not necessarily all equal. It's very important to remember that the definition of equality in Islam is not necessarily that position that Islam wants to lay out where everybody is equal. No, there are certain things that Islam will admit, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, that there is a certain part that men will have more right over women than the opposite, meaning that there's a certain foundation, there's a certain maxim where Islam actually considers that there are physical, psychological, and social differences. But even when it came وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنْ, the general maxim is that the rights, they also have rights equal. The general maxim is that they're equal in their rights with men. But there is one little area in where لِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, and scholars clarified that is in الطاعة, that is in obedience to the husband, that the man does not necessarily have to do when it comes to obeying his wife. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when this can happen, when this can be laid out in front of women, it can happen that وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ, that even Salama, she also wished that she can be a man. She wished that she can be a man because she felt that, well, they're doing jihad, they're doing all this, but that's when that ayah was revealed. And forbid that women would wish to be men or men would wish to be women, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given men certain qualities and women certain qualities, and therefore forbid, and that ayah was revealed, وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبُوا وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبْنَ وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ كَانَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمًا. In where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out that there's لا تتمنوا, don't wish what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had. Again, the word is فضل, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preferred certain qualities in men over women, or preferred certain qualities in women over men. In other words, they were gifted with certain things that the other one was not gifted with. للرجال نصيب مما اكتسبوا. Women will have certain gifts, they were acquired or they were given certain gifts, and women were also given certain gifts. وَاسْأَلُ اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Just ask the good things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمًا. To not necessarily seek that you would be equal, but اسأل الله من فضله. Ask from the good things from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. الرجال قوامون على النساء. In general, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly said الرجال قوامون على النساء, that they would have a certain authority in deciding a number of different things. This is not necessarily to say that women don't have the right to object or don't have the right to seek certain rights, but this in general is a place of responsibility and not an honor. Al-Baydawi actually clarifies and says يقومون عليهن قيام الولاة على الرعية, that in general that the men are قوامون, meaning that they would be in a place of يقومون على قيام الولاة, meaning that they would be they would be taking the position of a person that is in responsibility, a position of a person that is على الرعية, meaning a person that is taking a duty to take care of the different ra'iyah, meaning the different people that they're responsible for. Now, not acknowledging the differences will actually result in chaos on different levels, starting from the foundation of family to the way that it functions on ground. When we look at the center, we could see that generally it's between two sides. من عمل صالحا من ذكر أو أنثى وهو مؤمن فلنحيينه حياة طيبة ولنجزينهم أجرهم بأحسن ما كانوا يعملون. That these two centers, that one, whoever does good from male or female while they're in good faith, then فَلْيُحْيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً, then they will be resurrected in good life on judgment day, and they will be rewarded for better what they had done, meaning in their life. And the other ayah in where it made it clear and emphasized that equality is in إِنَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ وَالْمُسْلِمَاتِ وَالْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ, the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the qanitin, the qanitat, the ones that are pious, the men and women, and the list goes on and on with the ayah, that in the end أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. That equality, this is al-fadl, this is what we should be racing in, which is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and actually on both men and women. And the center is not male, but this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out how the society should function, that when it comes to responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given, just as Adam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized his role and emphasized that he is the Khalifa, also emphasized Asa Adam, that Adam had committed the sin. In having that being said, when we're looking at in practice that the Prophet ﷺ actually says أكمل المؤمنين إيمانا أحسنهم خلقا and خياركم لنسائهم, and he clarified that أكمل المؤمنين, that the best of the believers, because this is not a position of authority but a position of responsibility, he clarified that the most complete one in their iman, or the one that really has good iman, is the one that has the best of the manners with their wives. Why? Because it can easily be a position where others may take advantage. Now, the implication on different levels. As a mother, the Prophet ﷺ, it starts out with the mother, that even when you're a mother, the Prophet ﷺ when a man came to him and asked, well, who's the one that deserves the most respect? And we know the hadith where he said, your mother, and then he said, your father. If the if Islam was a patriarchal religion, then it would not have looked at the mother as deserving more respect and deserving more honor than the man. Then if it were a patriarchal religion, it would have considered that the man is the place of the center, the man is the place of authority, and therefore the woman is supposed to be not existent or not even mentioned, or the least a secondary person. When we look at wealth, a woman has the right for all the finances from the male family members. If she is a daughter, the father is supposed to be the one to complete all the different expenses that she is in need for. Same thing, when she is a wife, she has the right to use her husband's money and to get all the expenses covered, but he doesn't have the right to use her money without her consent. You could see if this was a patriarchal religion, then it would actually be considered that, man, you own the woman, you own her money, and all that she owns, and therefore you would just have the right to take everything that belongs to her, because anyways it's a patriarchal religion, if that was the case. But you could see that in Islam it did not consider that men are the musharri'in. It did not consider that men are the center. In fact, it held them responsible. And that's why when Hind bint Utbah, which is Abu Sufyan's wife, when she came to the Prophet ﷺ complaining that Abu Sufyan was a very greedy man, that he was a very cheap man, and the Prophet ﷺ said and permitted that she would take from his money even if she was doing it secretly, but he said, خذي ما يكفيك وولدك بالمعروف, or ما يكفيك وولدك بالمعروف, that she would take وولدك, because it's مفعول به, take what you and your children are in need for, bil ma'ruf, on good terms. Now, this is really important to mention, because if this was a patriarchal religion, then he would have told her that, no, you can't take any. But because Islam considered that the foundation is that when it comes to the finances, it is a man's responsibility, and that's why I laid out, even if she were to take from that money, if he is not doing a fair spending, then even if she does not tell him, that she can actually take from that money. Is that the case with Islam when it came to men taking the woman's mahar, or men taking from the woman, from the woman's wealth? Not at all. In fact, in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ permitted that a woman would pay zakat to her husband because she is not financially responsible over the husband. And that's the same thing when we're looking at it, in, in the other way, is that the man, he is financially responsible over the woman, and therefore he cannot pay the woman or consider what he's paying for the wife in terms of different expenses, that is in any way fitting in with zakat. Same thing when we're talking about working at home. Although majority of scholars, Shafi'iyya, Hanabila, and Malikiyya, considered that a woman does not necessarily have to serve her husband, etc. But generally, it's best that she would serve within the household, because this is completing one another, and this is generally il-ma'ruf. This is part of the custom, etc. But when we're talking about being within the home, it is important to remember that this woman is not abused in that system where she has no right whatsoever. Let's see, what about if she decided to leave the marriage? If this was a patriarchal religion, then we would assume that it is the man only that would have the right to decide whether the woman has the right to leave the marriage or not. But in Islam, it permitted khulu', it permitted khulu', and even for the reasons that some may see it trivial. Just like the story in the wife of Thabit ibn Qais. And Thabit ibn Qais was actually a man that the Prophet ﷺ said, Thabit, Thabitun fil Jannah, that Thabit is firm in Jannah from his name. And she came to the Prophet ﷺ and she said, no, I don't complain about Thabit, not in his piety and not in his morality, not in his morals. He's a very good man, well-mannered man. But I can't stand him. In another hadith, she said, but I would hate to go into kufr after being Muslim. So the Prophet ﷺ says, are you going to return that wealth to him? And she responded that she would accept to do that. Now, that isn't only in marriage, but that was also when we're seeing about patriarchal system, to answer that question. When it's a girl birth, the Prophet ﷺ actually said in the hadith that man yar'a fatatayn wa yuhsinu lahuma bi anna lahu al-jannah, that they would basically get Jannah. The hadith is clear. ما من رجل تدرك له ابنتان فيحسن إليهما ما صحبتاه أو صحبهما إلا أدخلتاه الجنة. That as long any man that would have two daughters or even three, and he would take care of them, educate them, take care of them, and actually deal good with them, that they would actually be the ones to accompany him in Jannah. Well, this isn't only at the girl birth. If we're talking about criminal law, in criminal law, women and men are totally equal. In fact, there are some things that in Islam has given women more certain rights. We're going to get to that, but you could see that when in criminal law, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, look at this hadith where إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَرْمُونَ الْمُحْصَنَاتِ الْغَافِلَاتِ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ لُعِنُوا فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. And this is specifying that those that accuse women of practicing or doing some kind of an illicit action, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed them. And of course, this is talking about them if they were actually free, in other words, that they were innocent. لعنوا في الدنيا والآخرة, that they would be cursed in dunya and in akhirah. You don't see the ayah and the same for men, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected and emphasized that a woman's reputation is very sacred. Not only her reputation, but also her ird, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let that the punishment on men and women, الزانية والزاني فاجلدوا كل واحد منهما مئة جلدة, that both men and women, if they were to commit zina, that they would actually have the same number and the same punishment when it comes to ibadat. Because Islam actually is not a patriarchal religion, women leave that is salah and siyam, during their cycle and are not considered impure. In fact, the hadith, when Sayyidah Aysha, when the Prophet ﷺ tells her, Nawlini al-khumra, get me the prayer mat, and she said that she had her cycle. So the Prophet ﷺ said, Haydatuki laysat biyadik, your cycle is not in your hand, meaning you're not impure, and you can get the prayer mat. You can get the prayer mat for me to pray on. That was very clear. And Sayyidah Aisha used to say, Kuntu ata'arraqul arq, meaning that she would munch on the meat, and the Prophet ﷺ would eat after her, because she was not in place of any impurity. Now, you could see that if this was a patriarchal religion, then it would have asked women to do an extra amount of worship, because they would be considered that women would have less faith. But Islam, in fact, gave women some certain break times, because although it could have added them and made them do extra, if this was to assume that women are the cause of the sin of Adam, etc., just as in Christianity. But in fact, Islam actually let that when Sayyidah Aisha came, where the Prophet ﷺ came to Sayyidah Aisha and she was crying, and the Prophet ﷺ tells her, لَعَلَّكِ نَفِسْتِ, it could be that you got your cycle and that's why you're crying. Now you think you can't complete Hajj. And she said, yes, that's the case. So the Prophet ﷺ tells her, افعلي ما يفعله الحاج غير ألا تطوفي بالبيت. Do what the person during their pilgrimage is doing, except don't go around the Kaaba. When you see that, you could see that in Islam, the base is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The application is not necessarily male centered. Let's look at the finance. When in terms of work, the woman has the right to work upon considering agreement. So there's going to be an agreement, but this is considering and keeping in mind the priorities within the family. The priorities within the family, are we talking about the priority, the family or the job, and the list goes on and on. But if she were already working, or if she had already put it in the marriage contract that I would like to continue work, then she would have the right to continue work, and then they would agree on whether she would have the right for the full salary, and that he would not have any right to use any of her salary, or how much is it. That's based on agreement with differences of opinions between scholars, almost 7 different opinions. When it comes to the financial inheritance as well, inheritance in general, why isn't there that equality? Now, number one is that when we're looking at inheritance, there are not only inheritance, but also witnesses, but the number of different differences, that not necessarily full equality. It is because, number one, the physical difference, and that physical difference has its effect on the financial responsibility. The financial responsibility on men is a lot more than the financial responsibility on women. Same thing when it comes to inheritance. It's all about nearness to the deceased, and also the financial responsibilities. Having that being said, you could see that there are cases where the woman could actually inherit twice of the man, depending on the situation within the story of inheritance. But unfortunately, many times quotes are taken out of context and not really understanding the maxims behind it. Now, where do we get the misconceptions from? There are actually a number of things. Number one is that assuming that men and women should be fully equal. This assumption is a lot of times, indoctrinating the Muslim Ummah, thinking that they have to be fully equal. In Islam, it's not fully equal. It's that they complete one another. And that Islam acknowledges those differences. Now, that's why when we're talking about, for example, many would assume that they have to be equal, and then they would assume, well, why can't women also be, practicing polyandry and having multiple husbands? Or why can't they cover the same? Or in legal application, why are they different in witness? Or even sometimes denying differences. The other part, where do we get the misconceptions from? Unfortunately, it's very important to admit that we've got many modern da'iyas. Many modern da'iyas are also at fault, in where many have been also indoctrinated with the feminist philosophy and liberal philosophy and ethics, and think that we have to say that Islam is just as liberal and just as Western, or just as postmodern as postmodernism can be. And this is extremely dangerous, or is as feminist. And you could see many putting out those what's it called, those articles that speaking about Islam as a feminist religion, and Islam as this type of religion where it's all about just like Western philosophy and Western understanding of ethics, etc. And this is unfortunately very common. On the other hand, you've got also very anti-women and very misogynist da'iyas as well. So it's not la ifrat wa la tafrit. You also have da'iyas that are indoctrinated with this, and you also have da'iyas that are very misogynist as well, that misinterpreted or even depended on fabricated ahadith. That these two sides can actually bring about lots of misconceptions and lots of confusions within the society. So it's not just the da'iyas, but you've also have da'iyas that are also misogynist, speaking in that way, where I'll tell you this exists within our own masajid. Misogyny in some scholar works, does it exist? Yes, it does. But here's one thing. Although yes, in some scholars' works, such as the discussion, is it male, female, etc. Now, we would all agree that text and sunnah are infallible, but the interpretation is not. So you can have a text that is not necessarily from the Quran and Sunnah, and is a scholar's quote that can be misogynist. But you want to remember that we do have, just as in fiqh, aqwal shadha, aqwal that scholars did not agree with, they are still within the books of tafsir, within the books of fiqh. You can still see them, and that's why you can, what misconception, where the place of misconception is that oftentimes people would assume that if they're in the books of fiqh, they're in the books of tafsir, or in the Islamic books, that is what Islam is, which is a very common misunderstanding. And remember, not because something is in the books of fiqh or books of tafsir does not necessarily make it that this is what Islam says, because there are so many different opinions that other scholars oppose, and other scholars clarified that this was objected. So you've got many opinions that have been objected by other scholars, and with evidence. So having that being said, even those texts that maybe in those interpretations, or maybe in those books of Islamic books, it can be there, but it doesn't necessarily make it Islam, because it can be just a person's opinion. Now, I'll give you an example. An example to it is that you had, I mentioned this before, and you have one of the scholars. His name is Al-Alusi, not Al-Alusi Sahib al-Tafsir, but he was actually related to him. Not the Al-Alusi Sahib Tafsir Ruh al-Ma'ani, I mean, but another scholar related to him. I believe his name is Abu al-Abbas al-Alusi. He wrote a book, Tahrim Ta'lim al-Mar'a al-Kitaba, that the evidence to bring تحريم تعليم المرأة الكتابة, meaning evidence to bring evidences to forbid women from learning how to write. You can mention that book, but you had other scholars that wrote numerous books in refuting that book, in refuting what was written in that book and the misogyny that was in it. So what about the female scholars? Where are their works? Where are all those different traditions that they had left behind? Well, number one is that when it came to writing, it wasn't that easy for women to pass on their writings as, in fact, the same with men. So not all men were necessarily passing on, or their books were available. And that's why we have a lot of makhtutat, and that's why Jawad Ma'ruf, you could see that he wrote and spoke many times about all the makhtutat, or all the manuscripts that are lost. So where are any women's manuscripts? There are many reasons why manuscripts were lost. Is that, number one, the question is, before we answer why are their manuscripts lost, number one is that not many women were writing at the time, because writing actually needed the time. And of course, women were busy with children. Women, their lifestyle was, was depending a lot on children, and that's why they weren't really getting the time as the other men were getting the time to write. Number two is that when we're speaking about talab al-ilm and al-ulum, a lot of it has to do with teaching al-ulum, with teaching these sciences. And that's why when we look at Madhab Hanafi, if it wasn't for Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani and Yaqub ibn Ibrahim Abu Yusuf, we would not have actually gotten the works of Abu Hanifa. It wasn't Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa wrote al-Fiqh al-Akbar, but that was really basically it. But the rest of the Madhab Hanafi was really based on Abu Hanifa's students. So it was really his students that transmitted the ulum, and not necessarily him himself. Now that's the same thing when we talk about other sciences. Most of the sciences, they were considered because those scholars were able to deliver those ulum in public, and that's why they had public students. They had other students to write these manuscripts, and later to script them and pass them on, which women did not really have that ability to engage with a lot of male students. Now, even you might say, well, why couldn't they engage with male students? Well, let's look at this. Sayyida Aysha, although a woman, and after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, she narrated over 2,200 hadith ahadith, but the ones to narrate most of her ahadith were actually men, where they were 162 men that narrated from Sayyidah Aisha and almost 63 women. So even though Sayyidah Aisha was a woman and she could not actually engage in person with men after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, there was the hijab that was the barrier between her and the men, but it was mainly men that narrated the hadith from Sayyidah Aisha and not women. So you're looking at I would more relate it that it was the society and how it was functioning and the social system then, and how and what positions were women engaging in and what role they were playing within, keeping in mind as mothers, that was really keeping them busy with other things. A very important thing to also note is that in Islam, throughout the history of Islam, the issue of, is Islam patriarchal? Is this not fair? Is that man or is that male scholar not being a fair scholar? Is he biased? That was never actually the topic that within the Muslim community that was discussed, because again, if we are to assume that a scholar is going to be biased because he is male, then we would, with that preposition, we would then assume that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by sending male prophets, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is biased as well, or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having only male prophets, that was going to bring about a bias tashri'ah, a bias legislature, in where there's not going to be that prophet that is going to understand what a woman goes through. And this is absolute kufr. This is absolute kufr to accuse Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of being biased or being patriarchal or being zalim or being oppressive towards any of his khalq, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that is most just. So it's really important that before we go into asking the words and the terms and calling it patriarchal or not, we first have to deconstruct, is it ever going to be possible to put men and women on complete and total equality? We don't even find that, not in nature, and we don't even find that in their anatomy either, and definitely not in the social construct. Just as you will not find it in any of those to put them in total equality in Islam is considered oppression. You would be oppressing the woman by asking her to do what a man is doing, and the same thing goes for the men. If you are going to ask him to do the same thing as the woman is doing, then you would actually be oppressing him by not considering or disregarding the differences in the physical differences, the different things that they were created with. By disregarding those differences, this is considered in Islam an injustice, and therefore committing not only inequality, but is committing oppression. Once you are committing oppression, then going back to John Locke's definition of ethics, then you are going to bring in chaos. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out different rights and responsibilities in order to bring about that stability within the society without considering one superior or inferior. It's not superior or inferior, because superiority and being inferior is all based on how obedient are you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in applying the different principles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out, and not necessarily basing haqq or batil based on your ego, but basing it on the principle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the center that we go back to in understanding haqq and batil. So any questions? I'd be happy, you can disagree, I don't mind. So if there are any questions or somebody wants to say something, Samia, I believe you still have your hand risen, so I'm not really sure if that was from before or now. So I'm going to unmute you, Samia, so go ahead. If not, Sam, you don't want to, I'll unmute Zainab. Sister Zainab, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So first I want to say there was a sister who was trying to join and she couldn't, but she told me to give her salam to everyone. After that, I think one of the questions that would come to my mind from everything that you said and that people use as an argument when you mentioned the strength, that men have strength compared to the woman. How will you respond when they tell you, well, I don't like, what kind of strength? Because a man, when he has fever, just a little tiny fever, he's lying down, all thinking himself he's going to die. When a woman, she can be so badly sick and she's still working hard, taking care of the kids, taking care of the house, up and down and everything. Yeah.
Fair enough, Sister Zainab. So here's the thing, is that those are from the strengths that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given women, such as multitasking, or probably, enduring pain, etc. So Islam does not say that men are stronger, but this is actually saying that there are certain strengths. And here Islam was really clear that when it came to decision making, when it came to taking the leadership role, Islam was really clear that it was more incumbent, and men are held accountable for that more than the women. So it's not saying that women don't have that they don't have any strengths. In fact, it did consider that, for example, the strength of a woman is to take care of the children. The strength of a woman is where she could give lots of affection to the children. The strength of so there are certain strengths that Islam was clear about. As for the hadith, when I believe I challenged somebody about the hadith that النساء ناقصات عقل, the word aql is not intelligence, because the word aql is more relating with the idea of decision making. Naqisat aql, naqisat in terms of determination, that they don't have the same capacity to bring about the determination where she is very authoritative, or being or let me use another term for it, in where naqisat aql, they lack that determination, and they easily compromise. Women easily compromise on their rights. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said naqisatu aql, and the ayah clarified another type of nuqsan al-aql, another type when it comes to determination or mind, which relates to a woman, the anatomy, the anatomy, about the brain anatomy, etc., is that even when it came to memory, that a woman, the ayah actually was clear about it, in where it clarified that when one might forget, the other one will remind her, because a woman goes through different stages where memory is affected, whether that is postpartum, or whether that was pregnancy. All those different things can affect memory, and because of the impact that they might have on her memory, when it comes to people's rights, this is supposed to be based on factual evidence. We need to base it on something that is going to be formidable evidence, in order to make sure that we're basing حقوق, we're basing people's rights on something that is strong. And when a woman's memory may be affected due to certain biological changes that are happening to her, could be pregnancy, could be maybe different the social, her doing all these multitasking, that it might affect her ability to remember. That is why Islam emphasized that in situations where it would be her, in relating to her life, which is such as a midwife or etc., that she can stand as the only witness, because women have a better capacity in understanding or even remembering things that relate to them. So when we speak about the different weaknesses, this is not saying that they're weak in everything, but this is saying that there can be certain weaknesses or strengths that men might have or not have. The other part is that I would like to answer this one. I forgot to mention it. The issue of is Islamic law partial towards women? So when we say Islamic law, there's a difference between there's a difference between what was laid out in text in the Quran and Sunnah and what was mentioned by scholars. So the scholars in some of in some of the um, in some of the probably what they had interpreted or laid out, it can be partial, and calling some things partial, it, you know, they're human at the end of the day. They're human at the end of the day. It can happen. The scholars can also be influenced by the society. This isn't something that anybody can say that, you know, no one says that, or no Muslim says that Muslim scholars are infallible. It can happen, but that's when we would see that other scholars would explain or would go back to usul al-fiqh and explain that this was cultural influence, or whether this goes back to the Quran and Sunnah. So if you mean by law, the interpretation, the scholar's interpretation, it can have some partial words in it. This can be possible, but that's when we would go back to the other scholars in order to help us identify whether this is going back to the usul, whether this is going back to the principles of Islam, or whether this is something that was, like I said, cultural influence right there. I'll talk about triple talaq later. Solutions from the traditional ulama. I don't understand what it means, solutions from the traditional ulama in general. There's usul al-fiqh, there's the principles of fiqh that we would go back to, that help the scholar of Islam, go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and eliminating all the different traditions, the customs that may be influencing that particular opinion, and attributing it to Islam. So there are different usul al-fiqh to make sure, and this isn't just on matters that relate to women. There could be matters that relate to all the different things around us, and it can happen that a scholar may be influenced by certain culture that surrounds them. So this is something that even scholars will acknowledge, and that's why they would consider one opinion as preponderant and another opinion is not. So we would go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and usul al-fiqh was to make sure that the scholars go back to those areas to help them free themselves from all the different influences that may affect their interpretation on the text. Is there any role for Muslim modernists to play? So when we say Muslim modernists, it's really important to mention that Muslim modernists, they would consider which is the progressive Muslims, they would consider that the Quran and Sunnah are their own, in their own selves are actually misogynist. So therefore, they will consider, just like Amina Wadud, that considered that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was a deadbeat dad, and that Prophet Ibrahim, or even Islam, or even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in regarding Il Khalifa being Adam, etc., she had actually committed kufr right there. This is straightforward kufr, to call Prophet Ibrahim that, or to even consider that the Quran is misogynist. This is straightforward kufr. So when we look at the modernist Muslims, they would anyways consider that the text itself is not infallible, so how is it with the interpretation? What modernist Muslims and progressive Muslims have fallen into is really regarding that the West and the liberal interpretation of ethics, or the liberal interpretation of the different things around us, is the center that we would base in our interpretation of right, wrong, women, role, etc. on, and therefore we would have to reinterpret Islam in the text and everything in order to match the Western paradigm. This is the main problem that Muslim modernists or postmodern progressive Muslims are falling in. Al-Islamu ya'lu wa la yu'la alayh. Islam is beyond, and whether that person wanted to consider that West is somehow superior in, or liberal or postmodern is superior, and therefore we have to match that, or not, in the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out the legislature, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala laid out al-haq wal-batil, and this is supposed to be the center, and not necessarily Nietzsche, and not necessarily Simone de Beauvoir, and not necessarily Butler or anybody, but in the end is that we go back to Quran and Sunnah, because humans are not infallible. Humans, they will have their biases, and they will have they lack the data in order to lay out a legislature. So what about Muslim feminists, for Muslim feminist scholars and their interpretation of gender? Unfortunately, the Muslim feminists, they too have fallen in this, in where a lot of them are actually using the same type of understanding. You see, if you go back to the epistemology, once you consider that their success is one thing, and you're using a feminist interpretation, if you're going to use a product, you're gonna buy a product, you're going to use that product the way it is assigned to. You're gonna buy a product, you're gonna eventually use that product in the way that it was that it was sold to you. And that's the same thing. If a Muslim wants to buy a feminist product, you're going to end up using the terms, you're going to end up using that type of the type of the ground, the equality, all that. Then if you're going to use it based on that product, then that in the end you're going to contradict your Islam. There's a foundation that a Muslim goes back to, which is al-wahi, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for a feminist, there's the foundation is equality. The foundation is based on that we are all matter in motion, that we go back, it's all about equality, and that we always have to go back to that. Now, if a Muslim woman says, well, no, I mean giving women's rights based on Islam and not based on the liberal or the feminist understanding of equality, I would say you're here practicing an oxymoron, because if the foundation of the two are different, then can you really ride on a boat that's sailing a different direction? If that boat is sailing into east, are you really going to be able to say, well, I'm going to sail towards the west? You can't sail into different directions, because you're totally using a different map. You're using a totally different map, therefore your direction is going to be totally different. And that's why the oxymoron is going to happen. You can't be a Muslim feminist. If you want to face the misogyny within the Muslim society, which I agree is there, if you want to face the misogyny that is there, make sure you don't practice another type of an injustice and only look at women. That's why you want to look at Jahiliyyah in general. The Jahiliyyah in general, it includes now going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in al-Hakimiyyah, in the judgment, in the way we consider legislature, and not going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the applications of it, and not going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the one that is ruling, and not going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in regarding the definitions of equality, and the list goes on and on. So when we look at Jahiliyyah, you can't just talk about women, the misogyny and the oppression that is happening on women, and not talk about the other oppressions. So for a Muslim, in order to face all those Jahiliyyahs, you need to go back and correct the main foundation of it, which is to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in defining ethics, defining justice, defining haqq, batil. You need to go back to that. Once you correct the perspective in the beginning, then you will see it corrected on ground. When Muslim scholars quote sources but are diametrically opposed to one another, what to do? So Ibn al-Qayyim did actually clarify that one, and it's really important when we look at the scholars actually going back to one source. First, we have to understand, well, even though they went back to the same source, why did they have differences of opinions? There are a number of reasons why they had differences of opinions. Is that it could be there are the texts that are qat'iyyat al-dalala or qat'iyyat al-thubut, or there are references that are dhanniyat al-dalala but qat'iyyat al-thubut. There are certain references that can have a literal meaning, but although there is straightforward wording in it and absolute wording in it, but there can be a dalala, dhanniyat dalala. What does that mean? That means that just like when we're talking about homophones, and where one word or one letter can actually have more than one meaning. So in situations like that, although they can go back to the same resource, but there can be some differences in the way that they can read one harf or one word within that, and can have differences of opinions on the interpretation. So this is one side. The other part is that there are certain, even though they quote from the same sources, but they oppose one another, is that in situations like that, you do have the option to do taqleed, which is go back to one specific madhab and base it from there. Or if you do have the qualification to go back to the scholars evidences and weigh the evidences, if you have the qualification to say this is hadith da'if, this is hadith sahih, this is asah, this interpretation, this in lugha, in the Arabic language, this is where the scholar is more preponderant, then you would have to go back to weighing the evidences. If you're not able to weigh the evidences, then al-ammi la madhhab lah. Al-ammi la madhhab lah, meaning the layman, you don't have a madhab, and your madhab is madhabu man yufti. Then your madhab would be the madhab of whoever is answering your question, and whoever is considering, whoever you consider, and you trust 5 things. If you go back to a scholar that you trust their scholarship, you go back to a scholar that you trust their piety to give you an answer based on Quran and Sunnah, and not necessarily based on what you want to hear. And you also go back to the scholar that you trust their understanding of al-waqa, their understanding of the reality that you're living in. So when they are opposed to one another, what to do? You want to go back, based on your ability, based on the things that we had mentioned. I hope I answered those questions. I know there are so many things, challenges that I laid out there. I forgot some of them, but I'd be happy to answer other questions before we leave. I think we had definitely passed our time. So Jazakumullah khairan, everyone, and inshallah to be continued. So before we